AMI. I think you spoke at the AMI event a number of years ago.
Yeah, a number of years ago, I think in Maryland.
Yeah, that was my first. That was great, by the way. And the career continues to go forward. And
Yeah.
Sylvia, I now have to read your book.
It's okay. There's probably like a free little synopsis online. You can read it. I always feel kind of like it's a long book. But yes, read it. It's about
You should say yes.
Muslim women in the United States. It's it's about them. So
okay, everybody, we'll get started right now. We're live on Facebook. Good evening, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all for joining us today on Facebook Live and Zoom. Thanks for being here with AMI today. Last week, we completed a 6-week intensive program for future journalists. Would-be journalists were joined by journalists, editors, writers from places like CNN, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and so many other institutions. In those six weeks, students had the opportunity to connect with professionals like Sabrina Siddiqui, Yasmin Abu Talib, and Sarah Khan, and learn about the industry that is journalism. Topics covered included investigative journalism, the business of media, misinformation, and a common theme that appeared again and again was related to diversity and creating a more inclusive narrative, a narrative that is better represents the communities that journalists cover. I'd like to especially thank out Zakat Chicago for sponsoring our program. They were fantastic sponsors, and this was possible with only their support. We were able to connect 22 aspiring journalists. Please stay tuned. We have more programs coming in the future related to those types of connecting journalists with future journalists. Today, we wanted to build on some of the conversations and really have a better sense of how minds are actively being shaped. A great deal of public perception is understood through the lens of media and also academia. How religion, race, and culture are portrayed or taught plays a large role in shaping views in society. We're excited to have all of you join us today for today's conversation featuring Rutgers University Associate Professor Dr. Sylvia Chan-Malik and CBS's Sharaf Mowjood, who will share their insights not only about their fields, how their fields have changed over the years, and most importantly, where things are going. Today, we are hearing more and more about CRT, critical race theory, and the BLM movement, ideas that are largely either in the classroom or an activist area, but have entered the mainstream political and media discourse over the last year or so. And we want to know the types of impacts they're having, not only in the classroom, but on the news screens. To moderate today's discussion and help us better navigate some of the challenges and the conversation we're about to have, we have AMI's board member, Akif Ahmed, joining us today. Akif is the co-founder and COO of Forest Light Capital, a holding company that acquires small and medium-sized companies. He's also a board member of Open. Akif, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shahid. It's great to be here with everybody for what I think will be a very engaging conversation with Sharaf and Sylvia. So I'm going to take a minute to introduce them both, and we'll start with a few questions, and I think it'll be a very good conversation, which I'll be less a participant in, and they will be more a participant in. Sharaf, let me introduce you. Sharaf is an award-winning journalist for CBS News. He actually spoke at an AMI event I recalled several years ago in Maryland. That was very engaging. He started his career as a stringer for the New York Times, moved to NBC News, where he traveled the world covering stories, and then crisscrossed the country following Donald Trump on his presidential campaign for MSNBC. Then moved to Huffington Post to direct their political video team and is now producing stories for CBS News. He spent the last 5 years producing for the Evening News with Nora O'Donnell, covering breaking news events as well as feature stories for CBS Sunday Morning, and is now producing content for the Race and Culture Unit. Sharaf, it's great to have you. Dr. Sylvia Chan-Malik is a scholar of American studies, critical race and ethnic studies, women's and gender studies, and religious studies. Very, very cross-disciplinary focus, which is exceptional and just great to have a chance to have you here today, Dr. Malik. Her research focuses on the history of Islam in the United States, specifically the lives of US Muslim women and the rise of anti-Muslim racism in the 20th and 21st century America. More broadly, she studies the intersections of race, gender, religion, and how these categories interact in the struggles for social justice. Sylvia is a core faculty member in the Departments of American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and an affiliate graduate faculty for the Department of Religion at Rutgers, University, New Brunswick, and was the Anschutz Distinguished Fellow in American Studies at Princeton University in spring of 2021. She's the author of Being Muslim, A Cultural History of Women of Color and American in Islam, published in 2018 by New York University Press, which offers a different narrative of American Islam in the 20th and 21st century that centers the lives, subjectivities, and voices of women of color. She speaks frequently on US Muslim politics and culture on a variety of topics, and has been present at NPR, Slate, Mike.com, Intercept, The Middle East Eye, Daily Beast, Huffington Post, Pathos, and a number of other channels and stations. Thank you both for joining us. Is there anything I missed that you would like to share about yourself? Or else we'll jump right into it. Great. So let me start with a question that I think is relevant to, on a lot of people's minds. It's, there's a wide, there's now generations of Muslim Americans, right? Probably over 4, 5, 6 decades now. People have come from different parts of the Muslim world, settled here, had their kids here, now their grandkids. You have multiple generations now growing up. And the way Muslims have been perceived in this country has also evolved up and down along that spectrum. So today there's a lot of discussion about the coverage that Muslims in Islam gets. Let me start by asking, in your experience, is it different today from what it was, let's say 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago? And is the direction positive or is the direction negative?
Did you want either of us to take that first?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I feel like it's a question about coverage, so I think I might defer to the journalist or the media person first, because I'd actually like to hear the answer from that perspective.
Sure. I mean,
if you don't mind.
No, it's totally fine. I'll answer that by, I got into media and my job because I didn't see enough of people that looked like me, sounded like me, had a religious identity like me anywhere in media. And I got that from going to a Muslim conference when it was a non-Muslim journalist who kind of challenged us to, if you want to write the narrative of your community, you got to be in the room where they're writing the narrative. So that was the light bulb, as there's light bulbs around me right now. That was the light bulb for me to get in there. Now, being in media for like 10 years, yeah, it's changed a lot. I got in there, right when Bush was kind of getting out of office. And it was a very still post 9/11, but a very different feel. There weren't a lot of Muslims in the newsroom. There were a lot of different questions about who are the quote unquote Muslim experts that, were putting on TV. And I got in at the tail end of that, where, at NBC, they would ask me questions about, what is the proper use of the term Allahu Akbar? What is the person what does hijab really mean? What does all that stuff? Now, I don't have to answer any of those questions.
All right.
Right? Because there is already an understanding of that, because it's been talked about, it's a safe place to ask these questions. And if I don't know the answer, I am one email away or one phone call away, be like, I don't know it, but I know a scholar who does know it. And this is a, legitimate scholar like Dr. Sylvia or Dr. Muzamil Siddiqui, or, somebody that's like reputable. I'm like, don't go off Wikipedia, call this guy or her, and it'll change. So, and the characters of who we're talking about, having experts who are Muslims, but just happen to be Muslim. whether it's about real estate or economics or housing or climate change, you can be Muslim and have an expertise in that. And it's not just about, quote unquote terrorism or Muslim identity politics. Sorry, go ahead. I interrupted.
Well, that's great. And so Sylvia, is kind of your lens on this is more and from an academic perspective. Do you see a role within academia to affect perception? And what has been your experience as you've covered this topic over the years through your research? How have perceptions changed or not changed?
I just thank you so much for your answer, Sharaf, because I was thinking, I was trying to find the parallels between academia and the media, because, many of us in academia study representations, and we are watching very closely about the representations that are coming out on the news and in film and in television, et cetera, social media, et cetera. And I wanted to start off by saying, I wanted to kind of push a little bit on something you said, Akif, about Muslims being here for 4 or 5 generations. In fact, Muslims have been in this country since the inception of the nation. Anywhere from 1/5 to 1/3 of the enslaved population. And we often forget that because it's, a part of history that is not part of this diverse narrative of America. We don't think about the fact that so many of the enslaved Africans who came here were from West Africa, which was predominantly Islamic, Muslim. And so we already see in how we understand Islam's presence in the United States, that there's a certain history that has been, kind of put forth within not just the university, but everywhere from, K through 12 education, which is, supported through images in the media, that Muslims suddenly seem to appear for many people on 9/11, 2001. All of a sudden, people who had never even said the word Islam or thought about it or had it as part of their consciousness suddenly became very preoccupied. And kind of these experts emerged to speak about it. And it was sort of a free-for-all. And I always talk about 9/11 as that, as a moment in which extreme tragedy, and this extreme kind of galvanizing event occurred in the nation that, is seared into the nation's memory, occurred at the same time, which had a devastating effect, not, on the nation, on the world, and also on the Muslim community in the United States, but at the same time, put a spotlight on a community, a history, and a presence in this nation that had never really been looked at closely before in this particular way. And it made Muslims themselves look at their presence and their position and their faith in relation to this country in a way that they had never looked at before. And so for me, what has shifted over the time, very similar to what Sharaf was saying, was that, I started graduate school 2 weeks before 9/11. And I came in with not a very clear idea of what I was going to work on. I had no idea I was going to study Islam, but in the space of the, I guess, wow, we age ourselves. In the 20 years since 9/11, since that happened, the landscape of scholarship has gone from me hardly being able to find any texts about Muslim women in the United States, the lived experiences of Muslims in the United States, race and Islam. It was so difficult for me to find any text. I'm a literary scholar, but in my book, I wound up going out and doing interviews and creating, doing oral histories because I had to. There was not enough in the official archive for me to create this history without going and doing that firsthand work. To a publishing landscape, both within academia and within the popular press, that has so many titles about Islam and Muslims, not just kind of these broad, like civilizational titles, but very, novels, young adult novels, stories about Muslim women and their lived experience. And the final example I'll give is I teach a course called Islam in and America. Mm-hmm. And when I first started teaching this class, I had no no template for how to teach. There was no other class that I could look to for how to teach this class. And now I've been teaching it for over a decade. And there are many classes like this, and we're all teaching it in similar yet diverse ways, and they are proliferating on different campuses. So I do think, and I have Muslim students who come into my classrooms, and all students of all backgrounds, who say, I never even knew. And you see those light bulbs go off in their head, where they connect themselves with histories and communities and stories in a way that they never encountered before. So I think that shifted a lot.
Great. So there, as I listen to both of you, there's a certain optimism in the direction this narrative is going in the country. And then the question is, how widespread is that felt, do you think? So I agree with you. There's a different sentiment around American Muslims today. You see it in commercials. As a layperson, you see it in commercials. You see it in the way topics are covered. You see more American Muslims represented on television shows, even for brief moments. Curious if you think that's a narrow experience still for the general American population, or do you think it's becoming a broad experience for many more Americans across the country? How widespread is this perception shift that you're talking about? Sharaf, you want to start with that?
Sure. I think
because the culture wars, what we call the culture wars, are widespread at the moment. How does this play into that, in from your perspective?
I think culture wars there will always be a culture war, whether it's us or another group. Like, the culture wars in this country will always exist. And there is only so much you can do to stop that culture war, because culture wars pivot, right? Right now it's critical race theory, right? The big, that's the latest culture war. Like, don't teach, slavery, or don't teach, Ruby's first day at an integrated school, or don't teach La Matanza in Texas, right? That's gonna be there. And for a while we were part of the culture wars, and to a certain effect, we still are. But I think when you talk about culture wars, culture goes both ways. Culture isn't just something negative, right? Culture can be positive. I'm gonna mention one thing that's pretty cool that shows why we should be optimistic, right? Marvel Studios is the hottest thing in the world right now when it comes to entertainment, period, in the world. Like, everybody in Hollywood, a writer, actor, director, producer, anybody wants to get on the Marvel train, right? You've seen Disneyland is creating Marvel Campus, right? That's how integrated Marvel is. Marvel just announced the new director for their latest franchise, Blade, is a Muslim director with an African-American Muslim lead, right? This is the pinnacle of culture for America that's being exported around the world, right? For everybody to see, not just in this country, but everywhere. No, this is the standard of excellence in filmmaking, in culture, in writing, in creativity. And at the helm are two Muslims. And on top of that, you have the Miss Marvel series that's coming out. That's going to be really strong and really empowering. And this is just Marvel, right? And this is across everywhere. So it's changing. Everyone should be optimistic. And the way culture wars work, it goes both ways. We're going to get slammed on certain things. Every group will get slammed on something. That's part of the culture wars. And fighting that entirely, some people will have to focus on that, but the tent of our community is big, it's wide, it's monolithic. As Dr. Sylvia explained, it goes back to the founding of this country. It goes back to Christopher Columbus's ships, right? Like, it goes back to Islamic Spain, right? That's how far back this goes. So this isn't anything new that we're dealing with. It's just we have different people doing different things. So absolutely, the optimism should be shared. It should spread. A win for Marvel with Sam and Mahershala Ali is a win for all of us. A win for Lena Khan directing Never Have I Ever, the latest craze, right, is a win for all of us. You know, that is this was not happening 15 years ago. Like nowhere near was this happening. We were lucky to get Morgan Freeman to speak at our fundraising events when he played Amor on Robin Hood back in 1991. Like that was like, oh my God, we got Morgan Freeman. Oh my God, Spike Lee. And then like nothing. And now we're directing Marvel. Like that should be, everyone should play 2 rakats right now and get some stuff.
Sylvia, how do you respond to that very interesting and summary of where Sharaf thinks the direction is going, and how does it get to the corners of the parts of the United States where perhaps, you know, the door is not as open?
So I mean, I agree. I think representation is a powerful thing. And what is so powerful about the new Blade movie with Mahershala and you know, is that there's a Muslim director. I mean, you oftentimes see representation on the screen, but everyone behind the camera is, you know, monolithic in a way, you know, without the same diversity. So I think that's really interesting. However, I mean, I am cautiously optimistic about shifting representations, though I also, as someone who studied representations and stereotypes in media for a long time, you know, agree with a dear friend of mine, scholar Saad Abdul Khabir, who says that representation is a trap. You know, it's great, it's good to have representation, but it can also be sort of something that we use as saying, oh, look, you know, look, there's Muslims on TV now. As an Asian American woman growing up in this country, I never saw folks like myself represented on television, but now we just had an Olympic gold medalist, you know, today. And so, you know, my heart still swells when I see things like that. But I want to caution against too celebratory of a narrative, not to pour cold water on that. I think it's amazing, but to say, of course, we have to understand that the structural kind of, you know, kind of larger power dynamics that really run things. So I'll say at the university, you know, I teach at a university, Rutgers, that constantly touts the diversity of its student body. We have a very thriving Muslim student population. We are one of the most diverse universities in the nation. But that type of diversity shift within the administration and the faculty is not as rapidly shifting as that of the student population. So what's exciting about the representation is that young people watch it. And what it creates in young people is a different vision of what can be. And so when you're talking about the middle of the country, you know, where people may not, and I don't want to kind of, you know, I don't want to kind of homogenize the, you know, my husband's from the Midwest, you know, it's a beautiful place with many beautiful people. I just want to say that, but where they might not get the opportunity, you know, in a place like New York City or, you know, central New Jersey to experience this diversity, culture does operate as a stand-in oftentimes for understanding other peoples, other faiths, other races, other ethnicities. And so it is important in that way that we have this complexity in representation that hopefully, inshallah, leads to, you know, more openness in terms of how we can engage in the classroom. Because students, and I'll just end with this, people often say that students, sometimes their very first opportunity of engaging with a diverse group of people is in a college classroom.
Sure.
And so that's why so many, you know, they come to college and their minds are just, because they've never had these types of conversations. So, you know, I am hopeful that these types of cultural and media portrayals open up perhaps a richer conversation for when those meetings do eventually happen in the classroom or wherever else. But again, I'm hoping those young people take up that mantle and, keep pushing for more change beyond just the representations.
Right. And certainly, as we continue in the conversation, I do invite people on the event today to send over their questions in chat or raise their hand. I'm happy to call on you. I think it's a very interesting conversation we're having, and we're happy to have you participate and get involved. So Sylvia, America has an incredibly broad range of campus environments, from your private universities to state, community colleges, other campus environments. It's a very uneven distribution across the country in terms of type and volume and where people end up. Have you noticed any trends on this topic that you can comment on, representation of Islam or Muslims that are noteworthy in either direction, positive or negative, or not? How is it playing out on campus generally from your perspective?
I'll use an example. I find that sometimes I had a really interesting configuration of my Islam in America class that I taught, I think about 4 years ago, where I did this thing that was part of a larger initiative across Big 10 campuses called the Digital Islamic Studies Collective, where I taught on 4 campuses simultaneously, synchronously. So I was the University of Michigan, Rutgers, University of Nebraska, and University of Maryland. So we had, students from all 4 campuses. And we were having a lot of conversations about Islam's meaning, stereotypes, how to counter stereotypes. And I remember, all these students from different places talking. And one young man, I believe he was at Rutgers, kind of engaging everyone across the country, and kind of having this pause where the entire class took a moment, took a beat, where he said, we spend so much time trying to say what Muslims are not. What if we actually spent time saying who we are and how complex, Islam and its history are? And I think one thing that's happened with Sharaf, like you saying, you don't have to explain anymore what Allahu Akbar means to colleagues anymore. People are like, oh, does that mean this? Should we be scared or something? I do feel like it's because of the incredible, sometimes negative spotlight on Islam and Muslims that has been, present for the last 20 years. There are more opportunities to get beyond simply the subjection of the media, kind of trying to get out under it and seeing much more of, the quirkiness, the incredible heterogeneity in the community, the youth culture, the creative expressions. There's a lot more room for that in the classroom. And I have been really privileged to have students do, projects where they show me like this, really interesting histories and backgrounds that they're coming from, and they're finding ways to express it in the classroom and beyond. And they're creating things like, young women, Muslim fashion, like, projects on this, and really just wonderful stuff that wasn't happening just because there wasn't a space for it, 20 years ago.
Thank you. It's very encouraging. So Sharaf, Christian Peterson asks, you had talked about someone has a question, you may not have the answer, you call a scholar, put them in touch. That relationship between professionals in the media and professionals in academia, is that happenstance, or how do academics and people like yourself connect? How do you know who to go to? How do they know who to contact? How does that work in this environment? And is there a way for people to engage if they want to be proactive?
Yeah, at least from my perspective, working in the newsroom, most if you're in a traditional, like I've worked at CBS and NBC News, we've had many Muslim scholars from a wide variety, on air from the 1980s on, right? Obviously, after 9/11, there was a lot more. But then the first thing you do is you just ask around to see, who's local. You always call your local university to see like someone that you've used before, and you ask. You do this phenomenal thing as journalists, you report. Right? Like you make phone calls and you find someone that's eloquent, smart, credentials, you check their bio, you check if they've been published, you see if they're anything on YouTube, you see if they've posted anything crazy on Twitter, right? Like you check all that to see, okay, is this person sound? And then once you find that person, you call somebody else, right? And then you call another person, just to get like, who are we talking to here? Who has done interfaith work? Who has been published before? And then after a while, you get this thing called a Rolodex, right? And from that Rolodex, all right, if I have an Islamic question, I know I'm going to call the Fiqh Council of America, right? If there is a specific law question, if there is a policy question, context, I have now scholars that I call on the regular for certain things, right? When it comes to, gender relations or stuff that happens overseas that's hard to explain, you figure out, once you've been in the business, who are some people you should talk to. And then, you need a Rolodex because not everyone's available.
Right.
You need a Rolodex because sometimes, if you're going on TV, like for me, I need someone that's TV ready, right? And not everyone's TV ready. I need someone that unfortunately speaks in sound bites. So there's a great list that gets passed around, and it's a list of Muslim female experts. It's an Excel sheet, and it has their name and their contact and references, and I use that all the time, and it's great. Dr. Sylvia is on it.
I actually think Christian Peterson, who asked the question, is the one who curated that list.
Oh yeah,
yes. I'm gonna just shout him out there if he's watching. He curated a wonderful list of female Muslim scholars.
Yeah, and that kind of stuff is, you have to keep working on these relationships.
That's the important.
It's not always one-off, I need a help. It's always in between stories on both ends. You have to maintain a relationship on both sides.
So
sorry, I interrupted.
No, so Sharaf, so Christian curated the list. Dr. Sylvia's on the list. That's as there's a good group of scholars coming up through the ranks right now through PhD programs all across the country. How do people get on the list? And Sharaf, if they don't know you or Dr. Sylvia or Christian, what do they do?
To be old school, you got to hustle. Like there's no magic bullet or a magic email or a magic phone call or a text or a tweet, and then you're on the list. Like, to get in, you got to work hard. You got to provide something new. I know this is a little tough talk here, but it takes work. I mean, you have to publish. You have to tell me why we should put you on. What perspective do you bring that's different, that's unique? Do you speak with authenticity? Right? I have a lot of PhD students telling me, can you put me on? Can you put me on? And I'll tell them, after you graduate. I get what you're doing. Graduate, get to a place, get comfortable, do something great, hustle, be like, write, continue to write, it'll come. It will come. Yeah. But sometimes you have to be a little patient and understand that there's a lot of people ahead of you, right, that are trying to get this. But the important thing isn't that you're on TV. The important thing is what you're publishing, what you're writing, and how you're engaging with your community. Like, that to me, as a journalist, as a broadcast journalist, is far more important than one soundbite.
Got it.
Yeah, and I would just like to add to that, putting my mentor cap on, as someone who supervises graduate students, where being an academic these days, there even is, this kind of expectation that you're going to have a social media presence, that you have something to say about, what's going on the political landscape, especially if you work on topics like Islam and race and gender and sexuality. And so I would say, really, you kind of building on what Sharaf said, it leads with the work. I mean, I've been doing this. I've been doing this for 20 years and studying race and religion in this country for almost 30 years. And I've, speaking and all of that is wonderful. But what is going to withstand and kind of carry on is the stories, because there are so many stories to tell. We can get out here and talk, but there are so many, in my own work and my research, there are so many Muslim women pioneers, voices, histories that we have not even told yet. And so that's the work that is going to make a great story, or to contribute to what we're really trying to do. Let's get, what we're really trying to do in the media and academia and thinking about Islam is we're trying to shift this master narrative of American history that writes out, constantly omits and elides and marginalizes all these other groups that have been here, present, making us, whatever that us is, who we are. And I'm not in any way sort of, a rah-rah nationalist, but this is a place where we all are, and we will be here, no matter who is president, whatever political party is in power. So we must expand that narrative. It is an imperative. So just kind of speaking on the internet or social media isn't going to do this. We need to create these stories. We need to create this history, and we need to have a much more kind of, focused, kind of clear idea of what we are doing and what the goals are, in this place where we are together.
There's a lot of questions popping up now. Let me first invite Iftikhar Hai to ask question. Shahid, if you can unmute. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, he's unmuted.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. My name is Iftikhar Hai, and I have a site which is United Muslims of America Interfaith Alliance. UMAIA.net. And and we've been doing this work from the last nearly 35 to 40 years. At that time, it was least popular, among the Muslim community to do interfaith work. Not at all popular, but we have a site and we've been consistent. And right now, I mean, the work is swelling, swelling, and from just all direction. So, I mean, I really appreciate Sylvia and also Sharaf and also Akif, for taking the initiative to really promote interfaith understanding. Thank you very much. So, this is a comment that I had, and I'm really proud of the whole team.
Great.
What you people are doing.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. And there is an interest. So, just as you said, there's a 400, 500-year history here that needs to be told, and told well, in a way that broad population of Americans understand it and makes it part of their historical memory. In the more recent period, there has been a lot of work on which our work is standing, right? There have been people who've started and continue to toil in the trenches of connecting communities who see each other with distrust or just lack of knowledge. And that's begun to crescendo, right? It gave the space for us to go to school and study things that were risky, like journalism, right? Or academia. And now that has resulted in professionals who are nearing the top of their careers in these fields, and they can contribute nationally. Can you say a few, either of you, about what it took to get to this point, to start seeing this optimism around the cultural narrative shifting, and what's it going to take to get to the next milestone? And how would you define that milestone?
I want to temper again, I'm not a cynical person. I am definitely a glass half full person, but I do want to temper the optimism because we are at a tremendously fraught moment in our nation's history. I mean, as someone who lived through the 90s culture wars and was a part of that as in school as an activist at Berkeley in the 1990s, that was a very kind of challenging and difficult and confusing time as well. And I would say right now, I think many of us still, wake up every day and are like, oh my goodness, what is this news cycle? What is going on? How do we bridge these divides? For me, I think, how do I even talk about this in the classroom? I'm constantly trying to figure out, like, how do we create a space in which there is compassion and empathy, yet, kind of a clear-eyed view of really the sometimes seemingly insurmountable obstacles that's, kind of fill our political terrain. So I just wanted to say that first. To say that, cautiously optimistic, just because, as James Baldwin says, I have hope because I'm alive, and as a Muslim, I do not despair. And that's kind of what I live by. But this isn't to say I don't see incredible challenges ahead. And I don't envy my children who are in their teens or my students who I see struggling with so much that they have to untangle and unravel in their landscape every day.
Mansa Bilal Marek King writes, I view representation as a precondition for the kind of structural change that ultimately is needed. If those in the decision-making circles are in sync with traditional homogeneity of this country, then there seems to me little chance for those structural changes to ultimately serve beyond those circles very well. So can you talk about the relationship between representation and power? And how power is embedded in a structure? And so this is the counter argument to the optimism, right? It can feel like it's changing, but is it really changing? Please, happy to share your view.
I mean, I'm happy to take it because it's something. I mean, I'll just say very briefly, the first thing I ask many of my students, or, I start many of my talks, and what I think about often is where our knowledge comes from. How do we know what we know? This is this question my students all laugh. They're like, oh, what do you mean by that? But how do you know the things you know? And so as we start to kind of try to answer that question, I ask people, where do you receive knowledge from? Why do you think this about this? Why do you know the sun is hot? Why do you know, and then we kind of come to this place in which you can pretty much discern that you derive your knowledge from, on the one hand, experience. I feel this, and so I know it. I know the stove is hot because I touched it one time and it felt hot. But we also get our knowledge from institutions, which can be the school, the media, politics, the mosque, church, temple, etc., politics. So all these spaces. And what does it take to create institutions? What Michel Foucault called discursive kind of power. Well, it takes resources. It takes people who have expertise. And so, kind of the relationship between power and what we know is very intimate. And things that we think are so kind of common sense are actually received ideas that our experiences have met at a certain point and kind of come to congeal as our identity. And I hope a good example of that is what is your relationship with the police? What is your relation? How do you feel when you get pulled over in your car? And so much of that is going to have to do with what you know in your body as what the police represent to you. So for example, me as an Asian American woman, I don't, who likes getting pulled over? Nobody likes that. But I'm not going to feel a type of, existential threat. For example, my dear friends and family who are African American are going to feel, especially African American men. So, that institution of the police meets my experience as, in my body and creates who we are as people. And so it's just, kind of the academic roundabout answer to say that relationship between power and representation comes in the ways we experience that representation and who created it. Where did that representation come from? What is the confluence of factors that produced it so that we come to meet it and kind of react to it in a certain way?
So Sharaf, in your world, there's a relationship between power and representation, right? There's, I think you talked about it a few years ago on the panel about being in the room where the narrative is being written. There's the role of the editor and the person who decides what gets covered with what title, when in the course of the day, to what audience. There's what the payors, which would be the folks spending money on the commercials, expect to see and not see in terms of the audience that they're trying to market to. Talk about representation and power in your world, and then has it shifted with respect to Islam and American Muslims?
First, can I just say, I think we should have a master class with Dr. Sylvia just talking about, that was awesome. I'm taking notes from what you said.
Class, no, I'm just kidding.
I may audit a class at Rutgers. You may see me getting like a B- on the papers. I'll give you a couple examples. I work for the race and culture unit at CBS, and this unit was created during George Floyd. Okay. Right? Most networks, most newspapers, everybody just realized, hey, we gotta focus up on this. It was always ad hoc. There was always people kind of doing it sporadically, but now we got corporate money, we got higher ups, people with power saying we got to do this. And I can speak for our end. They're giving us the leverage and the keys to run with it. So it's not just a committee on paper and, hey, look, shareholders, look how diverse we are. It's, you guys we have deliverables, we have to execute on that, you have to hire. So that aside, the person who hired me at CBS News was a senior producer. She's African-American. Was single at the time, raised 2 kids by herself, and she was a senior producer, one of the only senior producers at CBS News. Fast forward a couple months ago, she got poached to be the president of ABC News.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And she is African-American. She brings on other people of color, other people who think different, who think about the greater community, who have an idea that our story is everyone's story, and we kind of know how to play the game. Because a lot of this power politics, the power dynamics, it's about playing chess. It's not about, getting in and just checkering your way around. And she would always tell us, look, we know she's African-American. Even with all the African-American, correspondents and anchors, it's still a very long way to go, right? And they've been at this fight much longer than we have, right? They've been working on, Malcolm X sat down with 60 Minutes back in the 60s, right? When it started, Malcolm X put 60 Minutes on the map, right? It was Malcolm X. It was Mike Wallace talking to him about faith, about, what it means to be a Muslim in America. That's our story, right? So even with that, the power dynamics are hard. But in order to change that, you need to stay in and be consistent as much as you can.
Mm-hmm.
Because the consistency of just staying on, understanding that you are trailblazing for other people who you want to pass you up, is what's important. Because the person who hired me, what she did was great. Every weekend anchor was a person of color. She made sure there were opportunities for people like me to rise within the company, even if she left. And there's other people like her throughout various media organizations, right? And we know we may not see it, the power dynamic shift, but you see it slowly getting there, right? The way media changes, of course, it's not usually within our lifetimes. It takes a while. Why did it take so long for network to have a race and culture unit? Why did it take George Floyd? Why didn't we do this during Rodney King? Like when I was growing up in LA, like how come that didn't happen? Right? Or anything from Rodney King now, right? There's so many things, Ferguson, all that stuff. So it slowly takes time, and you slowly change things around, and you go 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's just kind of how it goes. So the idea and the attitude, like there's this power, structure that will never change. It does change. It's just not sometimes at the pace where we want it to, which can be very frustrating, especially for younger people. I mean, I remember when I came in, I was frustrated. I was like, this is crazy. How is this? And older people had to tell me, you just got to be patient, right? You got to win it by your pitches. You got to win it by working hard. You got to win it because unfortunately, when I started, like, if I don't do well at NBC, then the next 5 people behind me from Orange County, California, who are being forced to become doctors or lawyers or engineers, they're not going to see success. So they're like, why would I do that? Why would I take a risk, move to New York, work at 30 Rock, put everything on hold, not go to the social norms, don't get married right away, all that stuff that, our elders care about. Why would I put that on hold if there's no success, right? So you got to think 2 steps ahead and 2 steps behind. And that's how you change the power.
And Sharaf, some of the examples that you raised, Malcolm X and in 60 Minutes, like Sylvia, you raised the point that the history goes back much further with African Americans coming here forcibly and in terrible circumstances, obviously. And yet that's a forgotten aspect of history from an American Muslim's upbringing for those of us who were born here and raised here. It's present and then it disappears. It's raised in a speech or a lecture or a talk and then it disappears. Mm-hmm. Question from one of the participants is, how do we as Muslim Americans speak up against the anti-Black racism in the American Muslim community that doesn't get talked about as much as the need for Muslim representation in America?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wanted to kind of piggyback off of Sharaf's bringing up, this incredible 1968 CBS News documentary titled "The Hate That Hate Produced," with Mike Wallace hosting, which introduced Malcolm X to the entire country. And this was a moment in which, 1960, I'm sorry, not 1960, 1958, it was 1959, right? And this was a moment in which there was a young Malcolm. He was, just coming on the scene. No one had heard of him beyond New York City. And he came on the television, if you've seen Malcolm X speak, my students who have never read or encountered Malcolm X beyond their high school teachers saying he was the opposite of Martin Luther King. He was angry, he was, a radical. They see him and they say, oh my goodness, he is the most charismatic, thoughtful, kind of well-reasoned and just, and very funny and charming person that they've ever seen speak. And so he comes on television and he introduces a Muslim within the United States to the entire country, not just the elite coast, but the entire middle. This is CBS News, and people only had 3 channels back then. So they were watching Mike Wallace. So I always bring that example to say this was actually probably the first example of a Muslim American that most Americans had ever seen on their TV screens. And who is the other person that we understand as Muslim American? Muhammad Ali at this time, still probably the most well-known Muslims globally in the world. And so I say that to connect to the question about African Americans and Islam, because it's so interesting to me that when I started studying Islam in the United States, people were like, oh yeah, Malcolm X is Muslim. Muhammad, but are they like the 9/11 Muslims? Are they like the same kind of, like, how do we connect this history? And there was no framework or trajectory to do that. So I think part of the answer to that question of how do we talk about African Islam or think about anti-Blackness within Muslim communities in the US is to create this connection, to say, African Americans were the foundation of Islam in the United States, creating institutions. Malcolm X, again, to go back to the question of power, he created his own institutions. He was part of the Nation of Islam, but when he left the Nation of Islam, he created the Organization for Afro-American Unity, and he created the Muslim Mosque in Harlem. He was creating institutions, and these institutions, created the spaces in which future generations would come, right? So we have to understand these linkages. And as we kind of go back and look at what is Muslim culture, we look at hip hop, we look at jazz, these are Muslim Americans who are creating these art forms. And so once you start to make those connections, I find it much more kind of amenable or easy for folks to understand, like, there is this very rich and diverse story that is not sort of like, oh, here's the South Asians over here, and then the Arabs came, and then the Black Muslims are over here doing this. This is a very kind of, flowing sort of, narrative in which people were talking, people were connecting, they were flying here, they were flying there. And this is really the history of Islam, right? Globally, right? That you have people traveling and connecting and cultures melding. This is the story of Andalusia, of West Africa, and that happened in the United States too. And so Islam is all of that as a story where you can see these different cultures and peoples and faiths and subjectivities kind of trying to figure out a way, improvising in a space where there was no precedent for them to do so, but making a way. And African Americans are really at the heart of that story in so many ways. So I think that is so important for us to remember.
Thank you. Let me cover the remaining questions. I'll say them, and if whichever ones you want to pick up and respond to, please do, because we're getting close to the end of the hour. So Aisha, who's a associate professor and librarian at Baruch College in CUNY, she asked, I have a research grant to conduct a survey and paper on the role of Muslim women in Muslim organizations. I wanted to prove that we are more active and held a strong voice toward issues in the community. I'm having struggle locating female professionals in this field. So that's one question. The second question from Asif Haq is, what are the 2 or 3 best sites or in print that one can go to for teaching Islam in high schools as part of a world religions class? Appreciate recommendations there. Mansa Bilal Mark King asks, and this may be a question, Sharaf, for you. How do series like 24, why were they able to make such a powerful shift in how Muslims were presented and Islam was presented in America? And then Dr. Islam Siddiqui, Ambassador Islam Siddiqui, who's the chairman of AMI, asks, for both of you, there are a lot of positive things happening across the US that show Muslims are contributing in all fields. How do you get that message out?
Mm-hmm.
So I put them out so that we could cover them, but you don't have to answer all of them. Sylvia would like to start with perhaps Aisha and Asif's question on resources for a grant and then resources for high school.
I know we don't have much time, so I'm going to say, please, for both of you, email me. You can Google me on the internet and my work email will come up, and I'm happy to send resources. And also Christian, and I'll send you the link to this, the one Sharaf mentioned of the compilation of female Muslim scholars, which could link you to other folks. I'm happy to pass that along. So I hope that, and also for the resources, there's so many resources. It depends on what class you're teaching, what topics you want. Happy to answer that in email.
Great. Sharaf, would you like to pick up either of the other questions on how to?
Sure. Yeah, I think one was about that show 24 from like, I guess the early 2000s. I actually never watched the show because I wasn't a fan, but from my understanding of how Hollywood worked back then, and Hollywood has shifted a lot since like 2002 or 2003 when that show was on. Back then, and even to this day, it's about money, right? If you have a show that's gonna make money, they'll do whatever it can to make money. Forget the narrative, right? Forget what minorities you're dealing with, what stereotypes you're playing on. You know, if that's how Hollywood works. And from my literal knowledge of 24, I think the backlash they got was pretty severe and swift. So much so that Kiefer Sutherland did a PSA before the season finale or something about, you know, hey, not all Muslims are terrorists. You know, like he kind of did that because it was the response from activists was so strong. And I think most Hollywood now, they're kind of slowly getting the message. Like it's not all perfect, right? But it's slowly getting there. But the community and the activists and your response to that is what's important. Because the moment you say, I'm not going to watch that because I don't like what it is, and you get all your friends and your communities not to watch it, then they start getting scared and being like, well, we want you to come watch a Marvel movie and it's inclusive. So, you know, we'll do whatever we can because the value of the dollar is what they care about. And that's how Hollywood always operates.
Any closing thoughts on the question that Islam Siddiqui asked? There are a lot of good stories to be told. How do you get those stories out? Do you have any advice or perspective to share?
You just keep telling them. You tell them, you write them down. I mean, part of my motivation, we were joking around before we started about, you know, Akif was saying, you have to read your book now. You know, I wrote that book because I encountered so many incredible African-American Muslim women, in many cases who were in their 70s, 80s, 90s, where nobody had really asked them, you know, how did you become a Muslim? What was your experience like? What was it like being Muslim in the 1940s, 50s, 60s? But nobody knew what that was, and the conversation was totally different. So I needed to write them down. I needed to think about them and put them in a space where people would carry them on. And they were really for my daughters too, you know? And so that's how we get them out. We tell them, we gather them, we put in the hard work of listening and gathering and compiling and archiving stories, because if we don't create this archive, no one will. And that is what we have to do. We have to tell the stories.
I agree 100%. I am echoing 100%. Tell your story, tweet it, you know, create a Twitter account, do whatever you're doing, write it down, compile it. If you want to write a book, write a book. If your parents have an interesting story of how they came to America, record it, you know, put that out there. Whatever you're working on, tell your story, because if you're not telling your story, someone else will tell it for you. And that's not what any of us want. So whatever you're doing in any capacity, write for your local paper, pitch your local TV station. You know, if you're doing something I had a friend that makes cool syrups, and it's ethical, it's organic, and she's from Syria, and it was in the Costco newsletter, right? Like, that's cool. Like, you're in the Costco, like, whatever you're doing, tell your story. Don't stop, just keep doing it.
So Sylvia and Sharaf, thank you. It was a wonderful conversation. I appreciate that both of you joined and spent the full hour and a few minutes beyond to participate. I think it was, I think all of us took insight from it, motivation and energy. Thank you for the role that you each play in your profession, and for being on this program tonight with the American Muslim Institution. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Take care, everyone.